They say that as an architect, you spend your entire life worrying about the foundation. You obsess over the soil density, the load-bearing beams, and the structural integrity of the frame. You build something to withstand the wind, the snow, and the passage of time. But what they don't tell you, what they never teach you in design school, is that the most dangerous cracks never appear in the concrete. They appear in the people you built the house for. I learned that lesson the hard way on a Tuesday afternoon in June. I'm Walter Stanley. At 68, I've spent 35 years turning blueprints into reality across Northern California. My greatest achievement, my magnum opus, sits right on the edge of South Lake Tahoe. It's a floor-to-ceiling glass and cedar masterpiece I call Vista Point. I designed every mitered corner and selected every slab of Italian marble myself. I built it for my wife, Evelyn, 20 years ago. It was supposed to be our fortress of solitude, the place where we'd watch the sun dip below the Sierra Nevada peaks until our hair turned as white as the winter drifts. Evelyn passed away 5 years ago, leaving the house feeling cavernous and too quiet. So, when my daughter Daniela and her husband Curtis asked to move in temporarily while Curtis transitioned between venture capital firms, I welcomed them with open arms. I thought I was filling the void. I thought I was being a good father. I didn't know I was letting a pair of termites into the frame. To celebrate my retirement and clear the cobwebs of grief, I took a 2-month solo trip to Hawaii. I spent my mornings photographing the brutalist architecture of Honolulu and my afternoons swimming in the Pacific. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. I felt light. I felt like the foundation was finally solid. The flight back to Tahoe was smooth, and as the taxi pulled up 2847 Lakeshore Boulevard, I was actually humming. I could see the house through the towering pines. The way the afternoon sun hit the glass made it look like it was glowing. It was perfect. It was home. But as I stepped out of the cab, something felt off. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the scent of pine and fresh lake air. It was the heavy, chemical smell of industrial floor wax and cheap perfume. The second thing was the silence. Usually, the garden was a riot of color, but the flower beds Evelyn had tended for decades were gone, replaced by gray river rock. Minimalist, cold. I reached for my keys, but before I could even touch the lock, the heavy oak door swung open. Daniela stood there. She wasn't wearing the comfortable jeans and old university sweatshirt I remembered. She was dressed in a sharp, slate gray designer suit, her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful. She didn't smile. She didn't hug me. She just stood there, blocking the entrance. "Dad," she said. Her voice had the warmth of a frozen lake. "You're early." The flight got in an hour ahead of schedule, I said, trying to push past her with my suitcase. "It's good to be back." "Hawaii was incredible, Danny. I have so many photos to show you." I stopped. Behind her, in the foyer where I'd hung a one-of-a-kind hand-blown glass chandelier, there was now a generic, modern light fixture that looked like it came from a corporate office. My vintage Leica camera collection, which usually sat on the mantel, was gone. "Where's my gear, Daniela?" I asked, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. "In storage, Walter." A voice boomed from the living room. Curtis stepped into view. He was 37, had teeth that were too white, and wore a cashmere sweater draped over his shoulders like he was posing for a country club brochure. He stood with his arms crossed, his posture radiating a sudden, unearned authority. "In storage?" I repeated, my voice rising. "This is my house. Why are my things in storage?" Curtis walked forward, placing a hand on Daniela's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a gesture of ownership. "We need to talk, old man. Why don't you come inside for a minute? We have some things to explain." I walked into my own living room and felt like a stranger. Every piece of furniture I'd hand-selected over 20 years had been replaced. My leather reading chair, the one Evelyn had given me for our 30th anniversary, gone. The custom-built bookshelves, painted a sterile, blinding white. It was as if they'd taken a pressure washer to my entire life and rinsed the Walter right out of it. "We've been doing some thinking while you were gone," Curtis said, gesturing for me to sit on a sofa that looked more like a marble slab than furniture. I remained standing. "Daniela and I are expanding. My new firm is taking off, and we're going to be hosting a lot of high-level associates. We need the house to reflect a certain image. Your image? I looked at Daniela. Honey, what is he talking about? Daniela wouldn't look me in the eye. She was staring at a spot on the floor. Dad, the house is just too much for you to manage alone. You're getting older. You're forgetful. You leave the lights on. You forget to lock the back door. It's a liability. I am 68, not 98. I snapped. I designed this structure. I know every wire and pipe in these walls. If you're worried about the maintenance, I'll hire a service. It's more than that, Curtis interrupted, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. We need the space. We're thinking about starting a family, and your presence here. Well, it's a bit of a cramped style, wouldn't you say? Having a roommate in your 60s isn't really the vibe we're going for. I felt a cold chill settle in my stomach. Roommate, I'm the owner. You are the guests. Curtis chuckled, and it was a sound that made me want to clench my fists. See, that's where you're wrong. Daniela and I have already moved our things into the master suite. We've repositioned the house as the headquarters for Fowler Consulting. But we aren't heartless, Walter. We found a solution for you. He gestured toward the back of the property, through the massive glass windows that overlooked the lake. Down by the edge of the tree line sat the old workshop I'd built 15 years ago. It was a sturdy little building, maybe 400 square feet, designed for woodworking and storing garden tools. It had electricity and a small sink, but it was never meant to be a residence. The barn, I whispered. We prefer to call it the guest studio, Daniela said, her voice trembling slightly. It's perfect for you, Dad. You love your privacy. You love your hobbies. You can be down there, out of the way, and we won't have to worry about you tripping over our guests in the main house. You want me to live in the tool shed? I said, the reality of it finally hitting me. After everything I've done for you, after I paid for your wedding, Daniela, after I let you live here for free for a year, pack your things and sleep in the barn, old man, Curtis said, his voice losing the fake sympathy and turning razor sharp. He stepped closer, towering over me. The villa is now ours. We've already updated the security system. Your old codes don't work. We have a new lease on life and you aren't part of the floor plan. Daniela finally looked at me, but there was no pity in her eyes. Only a strange, cold ambition. It's for the best, Dad. You'll see. Now, your suitcase is already by the back door. Curtis will help you move your essentials down to the studio. I looked at my daughter, the girl I'd stayed up with through every fever, the girl I'd walked down the aisle with tears in my eyes, and I realized I didn't recognize the woman standing in front of me. She had been hollowed out and filled with whatever poison Curtis was selling. I could have fought right then. I could have screamed, called the police, or thrown a chair through one of those expensive windows. But 35 years of architecture teaches you one thing. When a structure is compromised, you don't just patch the drywall. You step back, you assess the damage, and you wait for the right moment to perform a controlled demolition. Fine, I said, my voice eerily calm. Curtis smirked, a look of pure, arrogant triumph. Smart move, Walter. I knew you were a man of logic. Go on then. Get out of the barn. I picked up my suitcase and walked out the back door. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the lawn. As I walked toward the shed, I heard the heavy clack of the deadbolt sliding home in the main house. I heard them laughing, a muffled, celebratory sound behind the thick glass. I reached the workshop, stepped inside, and flipped the single light bulb. The room smelled of sawdust and old oil. A small, rusty camping cot had been set up in the corner. My Leica cameras were stacked in cardboard boxes on the floor, treated like junk. I sat down on the cot, the springs groaning under my weight. Through the small, grimy window of the shed, I could see the main house glowing like a jewel. I could see Curtis and Daniela in the kitchen, opening a bottle of champagne, my vintage Krug. No doubt. They were celebrating their conquest. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd successfully pushed the old man out to pasture. What they didn't know was that while I was in Hawaii, I hadn't just been taking photos of buildings. I reached into my camera bag and pulled out a burner phone I'd purchased in Honolulu. I dialed a number I'd memorized weeks ago. Gerald? I said, when the line picked up. It's Walter. They did it. They actually did it. Are you safe? The voice on the other end asked. Gerald was my attorney and my oldest friend. I'm in the shed, I said, watching my daughter and her husband clink glasses through the window. A slow, Cold smile spread across my face, a smile that would have terrified them if they could see it. And Gerald, tell the investigators to start the deep dive. I want every bank account, every consulting contract, and every lie Curtis Fowler has ever told. They wanted the house? Fine. Let them get comfortable. I hung up the phone and looked back at the villa. I designed that house with a very specific set of features that only the architect knows about. Features that can make a person's life a living hell if they don't know where the off switch is. They thought they were locking me out of my life. I didn't know it yet, but I was actually locking them into a cage of their own making. And the best part? I was the one with the blueprints. What happened next would change their lives forever. But first, I had to let them think they'd already won. The first night in the shed felt like a slow-motion descent into a nightmare I'd spent decades building against. The temperature in Lake Tahoe drops fast once the sun slips behind the peaks, and the uninsulated walls of my old workshop held the cold like a tomb. I lay on that rusty camping cot, wrapped in a moth-eaten moving blanket I'd found in a corner, listening to the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of bass vibrating from the main house. They were having a party. On my first night as a guest in my own garden, they were celebrating. I stared at the bare light bulb dangling from the rafters, my back screaming from the lack of support. As an architect, I've always been sensitive to space, how it shapes your mood, how it dictates your dignity. In that 400 square foot box, surrounded by cans of old polyurethane and rusting saw blades, I felt smaller than I ever had in my life. I felt discarded, but as the hours ticked by and the laughter from the villa drifted across the lawn, my mind didn't stay on the cold. It went back to the blueprints of how we got here. I raised Daniela alone. Her mother, Elena, had decided the architect's life. The late-night deadlines, the obsession with sightlines, the long stretches of quiet focus wasn't for her when Daniela was only 6. She walked out one Tuesday morning and never looked back. From that day on, it was just me and my girl. I was the one who braided her hair before school, the one who taught her how to use a T-square, the one who stayed up until 3 a.m., building a scale model of the Parthenon for her 6th grade history project. She was my shadow. I used to take her to job sites, and she'd run around the framing of half-finished houses, declaring which room would be the library and where the secret passages should go. I thought I was building a foundation of loyalty. I thought the house at Vista Point wasn't just cedar and glass. I thought it was a monument to the fact that we'd made it. Then came Curtis. He appeared 3 years ago, a business consultant with a smile that was a little too symmetrical and a handshake that was a little too firm. He spoke the language of disruption and leveraging assets. From the moment Daniela brought him home to the lake, I saw the way he looked at the property. He didn't see the craftsmanship of the beamwork or the way the kitchen was positioned to catch the morning light. He saw a ledger. He saw equity. "You've got a lot of dead capital sitting here, Walter," he'd told me over dinner just 6 months into their marriage. He'd leaned back in my favorite leather chair, swirling a glass of my best scotch. "A house like this, in this market, you could be liquidating this, putting it into the tech sector, and seeing 10 times the return. You're sitting on a gold mine and just using it to sleep in." I'd laughed it off back then. "I don't need a gold mine, Curtis. I need a home." I should have seen the way Daniela's eyes lit up when he talked about millions. I should have noticed how she started complaining about the outdated feel of the house I'd poured my soul into. But you don't want to believe your own child is a shark. You want to believe she's still the little girl who helped you pick out the tile for the master bath. The bass from the house finally stopped around 2 a.m. I sat up, my joints cracking, and moved to the small, grimy window of the workshop. Through my telephoto lens, the one I usually used for architectural detail shots, I watched the last of the guests stumble out to the driveway. These weren't friends. They were associates. Men in expensive loafers and women in cocktail dresses who looked at the house like they were appraising a diamond. I saw Curtis walk out onto the deck, a cigar in one hand. He looked up at the moon, then turned his gaze toward my shed. He didn't know I was watching. He raised his glass in a mock salute to the darkness, a smug, self-satisfied grin on his face. He looked like a man who had just pulled off the heist of the century. What he didn't know was that while he was busy playing the big-shot consultant, I was listening. When I designed Vista Point, I was obsessed with the emerging smart home technology of the early 2000s. I'd installed a state-of-the-art integrated system, lighting, security, climate control, and a hardwired intercom system that ran through the entire house. Curtis thought he'd updated the security by changing the digital codes on the front door, but he didn't understand the physical infrastructure. He didn't know about the analog back door I'd built into the server room, a room hidden behind a false panel in the basement. I pulled out my laptop, the screen's glow, the only light in the workshop. I tapped into the local server I'd set up years ago. Within seconds, I was inside. I didn't turn on the cameras, not yet. I just turned on the audio feed from the kitchen. Couldn't have gone better. I heard Curtis's voice, clear as if he were standing next to me. Did you see the look on Marcus's face when he saw the lake view? He's ready to sign. He thinks I own the place outright. I don't know, Curtis. Daniela's voice was lower, hesitant. My dad. He looked so small walking down to that shed. Are we sure we can't just give him the guest suite upstairs? And have him hovering over every meeting? No way. Curtis snapped. The guest studio is a generous offer, Danny. Most people would have put him in a home. Besides, the paperwork is almost ready. Once he signs that quitclaim deed, this place is our primary asset. We can take out the bridge loan, pay off the Apex debt, and we're clear. We just need him to stay quiet for a few weeks. He looked so different, she whispered. He didn't even fight, because he knows he's beat. Curtis chuckled. He's an old man whose time has passed. He's obsolete, Danny, just like that vintage camera gear of his. Tomorrow I'm calling the decorators. I want that rustic look gone. We're going full industrial modern. I want this place looking like a skyscraper, not a cabin. I felt a surge of cold fury that made my hands shake. Apex debt. Bridge loan. My house wasn't a home to them. It was a life raft for a sinking ship. Curtis wasn't a successful consultant. He was a gambler playing with my chips. But there was something else in his voice, a tremor of desperation he was trying to hide from Daniela. He wasn't just looking for a new image. He was running from something. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. The backstory I'd built for my family was a lie. My daughter hadn't just been misled. She was becoming an accomplice to a man who would sell her soul for a line of credit. The next morning, I didn't wait for them to come to me. I walked up to the house at 7 a.m. I stood on the deck and knocked on the glass of the sliding door. Curtis appeared, wearing a silk robe that I recognized as a gift I'd bought for myself in Florence. He looked annoyed. He slid the door open just a crack. A bit early for a house call, isn't it, Walter? I need my medication, I said, keeping my voice flat, playing the part of the frail, defeated elder. I left my heart pills in the cabinet in the master bath. And I need my specialized drawing pens. They're in the study. Curtis sighed, checking his gold watch. 5 minutes. Daniela is still sleeping, so keep it down. And don't get any ideas about reclaiming your room. Your things are in boxes in the garage. I stepped inside. The house felt cold. They'd already turned the thermostat down to 62, a cost-saving measure, I'm sure. I walked toward the master bedroom, but I didn't go for the medicine cabinet. I detoured toward the server room hidden behind the laundry area. I had exactly 300 seconds. I slipped into the small, cramped space behind the water heater. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I reached behind the main junction box and pulled out a small, encrypted drive I'd prepared months ago. I plugged it into the master hub. This wasn't just a monitor. It was a worm. It would begin mirroring every digital transaction, every email, and every phone call made over the house's Wi-Fi. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Walter? What are you doing back there? Curtis's voice was closer now. I grabbed a bottle of laundry detergent from the shelf and stepped out, looking confused. I thought I saw a leak. The pipes in this house. You have to be careful with the pressure. Curtis looked at me with pure condescension. The pipes are fine, old man. Get your pills and get out. We have a realtor coming by at 10 to do an unofficial appraisal. An appraisal? I asked, feigning a tremor in my hand. Are you selling? Just checking the market value, he said, ushering me toward the master bath. Knowledge is power, right? As I grabbed my pills, which were actually just vitamins I'd left behind, I saw a notification flash on Curtis's phone, which was sitting on the marble counter. It was a text from a number not in his contacts. The guys from Apex are losing patience, Curtis. If the equity isn't confirmed by Friday, we're coming to the lake to collect in person. I memorized the phrasing, collect in person. That didn't sound like a bank. That sounded like something much darker. I walked back out to the deck, my duffel bag over my shoulder. Daniela was standing in the kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee. She looked at me for a split second, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the old Danny, a flash of guilt so bright it almost made her flinch. "Bye, Dad," she whispered. "Goodbye, sweetheart," I said. I walked back down to the shed, but I didn't feel defeated anymore. I felt like a hunter. I opened my laptop and watched the progress bar on the worm. 10%, 20%, 40%. Curtis Fowler thought he was an expert at leveraging assets. He didn't realize that in this house, I was the only asset that mattered. And he certainly didn't know that the realtor he had coming over at 10 o'clock wasn't the only guest I'd invited to the party. I leaned back against the rough wood of the shed wall. My back still hurt, but the cold didn't bother me anymore. I had a lot of work to do. Because what Curtis hadn't realized was that while he was busy trying to sell my house, I was busy finding out exactly who he owed $340,000 to and why they were so eager to see him fail. I didn't know it yet, but the man coming for Curtis wasn't a banker. He was a shark I'd spent the last 3 months studying. And what happened next would turn my beautiful glass house into a cage that Curtis would never be able to escape. The realtor arrived at precisely 10 a.m. in a white Lexus that looked like it cost more than the small mountain cabin I'd first built for Evelyn back in the 80s. From the window of the workshop, I watched as a woman in a beige power suit stepped out, holding a tablet like a holy relic. Curtis met her at the driveway, his smile wide enough to be visible from space. He was performing again, the master of the estate, gesturing toward the cantilevers and the floor-to-ceiling glass with the casual air of a man who'd paid for every nail. I watched them through my telephoto lens, the shutter of my Leica clicking softly. Documentation. That was what Gerald had insisted on. Every person who entered, every business associate, every appraisal. I was building a file that would eventually become the tombstone of Curtis Fowler's ambitions. But as I watched them walk through the front door, my mind drifted back to the first time the foundation started to groan. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow, creeping rot. A year ago, during our first Christmas together after they moved in, Curtis had given me a gift. It was a high-end digital tablet, preloaded with lifestyle management apps. "To help you stay organized, Walter," he'd said, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "At your age, the little details start to slip. This will track your appointments, your meds, even your heart rate. We just want you to stay sharp." I'd laughed it off then, thinking it was just the clumsy concern of a son-in-law trying to fit in. I didn't realize it was the first piece of evidence he was gathering. He'd started making little comments at dinner parties, loud enough for the guests to hear. "Oh, Walter, you already told that story about the Seattle project twice tonight. Are you feeling okay?" Or, "Don't worry about the wine, Dad. I'll handle the cellar inventory. You just relax." He was gaslighting me in my own home, slowly painting the picture of a man in decline. And Daniela, she'd watched it happen with a silent, growing compliance. She'd started looking at me with this pitying tilt of the head, the way you look at a dog that's too old to make it up the stairs. That was the first crack. I should have shored up the walls then, but I was too blinded by the desire to have a family again. I was snapped back to the present by a chime on my laptop. The worm I'd installed in the server room was feeding me the audio from the realtor's tour. "And here," Curtis's voice crackled through the speakers, "is the master suite. We're planning on expanding the balcony to a full wraparound. The current design is a bit restrictive. The previous owner had a very old-school approach to the lake view." "Restrictive?" the realtor echoed, her voice professionally impressed. "Mr. Fowler, this is one of the most celebrated residential designs in the Tahoe Basin. The Stanley House is a landmark." "It was a landmark," Curtis said, and I could practically hear the smirk. "But landmarks are for tourists. We're building a legacy. My father-in-law is, well, he's comfortably situated in the studio. He's happy to see the house evolve. Isn't that right, Daniela?" There was a long pause. "Yes," Daniela whispered. "He wants us to be happy." I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with the daughter I'd raised. She was standing in the bedroom where her mother had spent her final days, watching a stranger talk about tearing down the walls I'd built for her, and she was agreeing. I closed the laptop. I couldn't listen to any more. Not yet. About an hour later, After the realtor had left, I saw Daniela walking toward the workshop. She was carrying a tray with a sandwich and a glass of iced tea. She looked around the messy, sawdust-covered space with a grimace, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. "I brought you some lunch, Dad," she said, setting the tray on an old workbench. "It's turkey and avocado. Your favorite." "Thank you, Daniela," I said, not moving from my stool. She hovered for a moment, her eyes darting toward the boxes of my gear stacked like cordwood. "Look, about the appraisal today. It's just for the insurance. Curtis needs to update the policy since we're officially occupants now. It doesn't mean anything." "Is that what he told you?" I asked. "Or is that what the quitclaim deed he wants me to sign is for?" Daniela stiffened. "How did you know about that?" "I'm an architect, Danny. I read the fine print of every structure, especially the legal ones. Curtis wants me to sign over the title to you both. He says it's for estate planning, to avoid the probate courts later." I looked her dead in the eye. "Is that what you want? For me to give away my life's work while I'm still living in the garden shed?" She looked away, her fingers twisting the hem of her expensive blazer. "It would just make things simpler, Dad. If anything happened to you, the house would be tied up for years. Curtis just wants to make sure I'm taken care of. He says you're being stubborn because you're afraid of the future." "I'm not afraid of the future, Daniela. I'm afraid of what your husband is doing to you." "He's not doing anything," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp. "He's trying to build a business. He's trying to give us the life you had. You had your turn, Dad. You got the awards, the fame, the big house. Why can't you just let us have ours? By taking mine?" "It's just a building," she cried, and for a second, I saw the face of the angry teenager she used to be. "It's just wood and glass. Why do you care more about the walls than you do about me?" She turned and ran back toward the house before I could answer. She didn't understand. She couldn't see that the walls were her. I built them to protect her, to keep her safe from the world. Now, she was letting the wolf in through the front door and blaming me for the cold. I didn't eat the sandwich. I spent the afternoon on my phone, calling in favors from old clients and colleagues. By 4 p.m., I had a meeting scheduled with Helen Clark, the private investigator Gerald had recommended. We met at a small, greasy diner 20 miles away in Truckee. Helen was a woman who looked like she'd been carved out of granite, short gray hair, eyes like a hawk, and a way of smoking a cigarette that made it look like a weapon. She slid a thin manila folder across the table toward me. "You were right to be suspicious, Walter," she said, her voice a low rasp. "Your son-in-law isn't a venture capitalist. He's a professional parasite. He doesn't have a firm. He has a series of shell companies that he uses to shuffle debt from one investment to the next. He's currently underwater to the tune of $340,000 to a group called Apex." "Who is Apex?" "A private equity group that doesn't use the court system to settle their disputes," Helen said, taking a sip of black coffee. "They're aggressive. They've been looking for him for 3 months. That's why he moved into your place. It's a gated property with high-end security. It's a fortress. He's not living there because he loves the view. He's living there because it's the only place they can't get to him without making a scene." My stomach turned. "And the appraisal? The bridge loan? He's trying to use the equity in your house as collateral to pay off Apex. But he can't get the loan without your signature on the title. That's why he's pushing the incompetency angle. If he can prove you aren't fit to manage your affairs, Daniela becomes your legal guardian. And as your guardian, she can sign that title over to him." I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. This wasn't just a family dispute. It was a siege. "What about Daniela?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Does she know about the debt? About Apex?" "According to his emails, no," Helen said. "He's telling her that he's leveraging the house to launch a new fund that will make them millions. He's playing on her ambition, Walter, and her guilt. He's convinced her that you're a burden, and that he's the only one who can handle the weight." I sat in silence for a long time, watching the rain start to streak the windows of the diner. I thought about the little girl who used to sit on my lap while I drew floor plans. I thought about the man who was currently sleeping in my bed, drinking my wine, and plotting to steal the very ground I stood on. "I need more than debt records, Helen," I said. "I need something that will wake Daniela up, something that even she can't ignore." Helen leaned in, her eyes glinting. "I've been following him. He's not just lying about the money, Walter. He's got a regular business meeting at a hotel in Reno every Tuesday afternoon. A woman named Jessica Vance. She's younger, blonde, and she thinks he's a millionaire bachelor. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. It was the structural flaw I needed. Curtis Fowler wasn't just a thief. He was a cliché. Get me the photos, I said. Get me everything. I drove back to the lake in the dark. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw the lights of the villa blazing. They were having another dinner. I could see their silhouettes through the glass, Curtis laughing, Daniela leaning against him. I didn't go to the workshop. I went to the main electrical box, located in a concealed panel near the garage. It was a system I'd designed with a master override for emergencies, a way to cut the power to specific zones without tripping the main breakers. I flipped a switch. Inside the house, the lights in the kitchen and living room stayed on, but the climate control and the hot water heater in the master suite went dead. It was a small move, a subtle annoyance, a glitch in the perfect life they were trying to build. I walked down to the shed and sat on my cot. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Curtis. Hey Walter, the heat's out in the main bedroom. You probably messed with the wires when you were checking for leaks earlier. Fix it tomorrow or I'm deducting the repair cost from your allowance. I didn't reply. I just looked at the blinking cursor on my laptop, watching the worm continue its work. I didn't know it yet, but the realtor wasn't the only one doing an appraisal that week. I was appraising the cost of my daughter's soul, and by the time I was finished, I was going to make sure Curtis Fowler realized that the old man in the barn wasn't just out of the way. He was the one holding the match. But I had no idea that my first act of sabotage would trigger a response from Curtis that was far more violent than I ever expected. The next morning, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. The roar of a chainsaw right outside my shed door. The roar of the chainsaw wasn't just loud, it was predatory. It vibrated through the thin, uninsulated walls of the workshop, rattling the boxes of my Leica lenses and shaking the very marrow of my bones. I scrambled off the cot, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and threw open the shed door. The air was thick with the blue-gray haze of two-stroke exhaust. There, standing in the middle of the path that led from the main house to my studio, was Curtis. He was wearing brand-new work boots and a pair of designer sunglasses, handled the heavy saw with a terrifying, amateurish clumsiness. And he was cutting down the Japanese maple. My breath hitched. That tree wasn't just landscaping. Evelyn and I had planted it the day we broke ground on Vista Point. It was a delicate, weeping thing that turned a brilliant, fiery crimson every autumn, the exact color of the lipstick Evelyn wore on our first date. It was the heart of the garden, the focal point of the eastern view. Stop, I screamed, lunging forward. Curtis, stop. He didn't stop. He didn't even look at me until the main trunk groaned and tilted, crashing into the dirt with a sickening, leafy thud. Only then did he kill the engine. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the silence of a grave. The silence of a grave. What are you doing? I gasped, falling to my knees beside the mangled branches. The wood was white and raw, bleeding sap into the soil. This tree, Evelyn planted this. Curtis wiped a smudge of oil off his forehead with the back of his glove. He looked down at me, not with anger, but with a terrifying, cold amusement. It was obstructing the view of the lake from the new breakfast nook, Walt. Property values are all about sight lines. You should know that. Besides, he stepped over the fallen trunk, the saw dangling from his hand like a severed limb. It was old, a bit spindly. Just like everything else around here, it was taking up space it didn't earn. You had no right, I whispered. I have every right, he snapped, his voice suddenly dropping an octave. I'm the one managing this estate now. I'm the one paying the taxes, or I will be. Once you stop playing this ridiculous game with the title. This is a message. Walter, every time you glitch the power or mess with the heater, I'm going to remove something else you love from this property. Next time, it might be that fancy camera collection in the boxes. Or maybe I'll just have the workshop demolished and put in a lap pool. You're a tenant now. Act like one. He turned and walked back toward the house, whistling a tuneless melody. I looked up at the kitchen window. Daniela was standing there, a silhouette against the morning light. She was holding a coffee mug, watching her husband destroy her mother's memory. She didn't move. She didn't wave. She just closed the blinds. I sat in the dirt for an hour, my hands buried in the red leaves of the dying maple. This was the escalation. Curtis was no longer content with just taking my house. He wanted to break my spirit. He wanted to make the environment so hostile that I would sign anything just to be allowed to leave with my dignity intact. But he'd made a mistake. He'd attacked the architecture of my heart, and in doing so, he'd removed the last lingering doubt I had about destroying him. I went back to the shed and opened my laptop. The worm had been busy. I spent the morning sifting through a mountain of digital trash. Curtis's browsing history, his frantic Google searches for California elder incompetency laws, and his encrypted messages to someone named Vince. And then, I found the smoking gun. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a PDF, a draft of a construction contract. Curtis had already signed an agreement with a local developer to subdivide the Vista Point lot. He wasn't just planning to live in my house, he was planning to tear it down and build 3 luxury modular units to maximize the land value. He was going to erase the Stanley house from the map entirely. My hands shook as I scrolled through the site plans. He'd marked the workshop, my current home, as Site C. I didn't have much time. That afternoon, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the driveway. It wasn't the realtor. 2 men stepped out, big men in ill-fitting suits who didn't look like they spent much time in Lake Tahoe. I watched from the shed as Curtis met them at the gate. His usual swagger was gone. His shoulders were hunched, and he kept looking over his shoulder at the house. I switched on the outdoor mic. "Told you Friday," Curtis was saying, his voice high and thin. "I just need the signature. The old man is being difficult, but I've got him on the ropes. 1 more week." "The boss doesn't do 1 more week, Fowler," one of the men said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "You leveraged $250,000 in Apex funds against a property you don't even own. That's called fraud where I come from. And in our circle, fraud has a very specific interest rate, usually paid in bone density. I have the equity," Curtis hissed. "Look at this place. It's worth $3 million easy. I just need to finalize the guardianship papers. My wife is on board. We just need the court date." "Friday," the man repeated, tapping a finger against Curtis's chest. "If the transfer isn't initiated by Friday, we don't come back to talk. We come back to liquidate." They got back into the SUV and roared away, kicking up gravel. Curtis stood in the driveway for a long time, staring at his shoes. He looked like a man who was finally realizing that the house of cards he'd built was sitting in a wind tunnel. I didn't know it yet, but the liquidation had already begun. That evening, the humiliation reached its peak. Curtis and Daniela were hosting a strategy dinner for a few local power players, people I'd known for decades. Men like Arthur Vance, the head of the zoning board, and Sarah Miller, a prominent real estate attorney. Around 6 p.m., Daniela came down to the shed. She was wearing a dress that cost more than the car I'd bought her for graduation. She looked beautiful, but her eyes were hollow. "Dad," she said, her voice small, "we're having guests. Curtis, he thinks it would be best if you came up and joined us for the first course." I looked at her, surprised. "He wants me there? He wants everyone to see that you're being cared for," she said, the words sounding rehearsed. "He's going to announce the new foundation we're starting in your name. Please, just put on a clean shirt. For me, if this goes well, he promised things will get easier for you." I knew it was a trap. I knew I was being brought out like a prize pony to show the neighbors that the old man was happy and healthy, despite the rumors. But I also knew it was my best chance to get close to the center of the structure. "I'll be there, Danny," I said. I put on my best linen shirt and walked up to the house. The interior was glowing, filled with the scent of roasted lamb and expensive wine. As I entered the dining room, the conversation died for a split second before Arthur Vance stood up. "Walter, good to see you, old friend. We heard you were taking it easy these days." "Living the simple life, Arthur," I said, taking the seat at the end of the table, the seat furthest from the head, where Curtis was perched like a king. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Curtis spent the entire meal translating for me. "Walter was just saying how much he enjoys the workshop," Curtis told Sarah Miller after I'd barely finished a sentence about the weather. "He's always been a man of the earth, haven't you, Walt? He finds the main house a bit too stimulating for his current state. We've had to simplify things for him." He poured me a glass of wine, the cheap stuff from the grocery store, while everyone else drank the 98 Bordeaux I'd been saving. "To the future of Vista Point," Curtis said, raising his glass. "And to Walter. May his golden years be as quiet as the lake." Everyone toasted. I felt like a ghost at my own funeral. But as I sat there, playing the part of the nodding, slightly confused elder, I slipped my phone out under the table. I sent a single text to Helen Clark. "Send the Reno files to Sarah Miller's personal email. Now." I watched Sarah's phone, which was sitting on the table next to her plate. A minute later, it buzzed. She glanced at it, her brow furrowing. She didn't open it immediately, but she looked at Curtis with a new, sharp curiosity. The dinner ended with Curtis standing up to make his big announcement. As many of you know, Walter has been struggling with his memory. It's a tragic part of the journey, but Daniela and I are committed to his legacy. That's why we're transitioning the property into a family trust, managed by Fowler Consulting, to ensure that the Stanley name and the Stanley fortune is protected from the vultures of the market. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "In fact, Walter has the papers right here. He's going to sign the initial intent tonight, in front of all his closest friends, to show that we're a united front." He slid a thick folder across the table toward me. A pen followed. The room went silent. Daniela was holding her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the table. Sarah Miller was watching me, her phone still glowing in her hand. Arthur Vance looked uncomfortable, sensing the tension but too polite to speak. I looked at the papers. It wasn't just a trust agreement, it was a full power of attorney. If I signed this, I wasn't just giving them the house, I was giving them my life. "I don't think I can sign this, Curtis," I said, my voice projecting with the strength I'd used to command construction crews for 30 years. The smile on Curtis's face didn't just fade, it evaporated. "Walter, don't be difficult. You're confused. We talked about this." "We did talk," I said, standing up, "but I think our guests would be interested in a different kind of documentation." "Sarah, did you get that email I sent? The one regarding the business meetings Curtis has been having in Reno?" Sarah Miller picked up her phone. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the photos. Helen had taken Curtis and Jessica Vance, clear as day, at the hotel bar. Then she scrolled to the debt reports from Apex. "Curtis?" Sarah asked, her voice like ice. "What is this?" "This is a report on your personal liabilities." "And, is that Arthur's daughter, Jessica?" The room exploded. Arthur Vance stood up so fast his chair flipped over. "What did you say? My daughter?" Curtis went pale, a sickly, translucent white. "Arthur, I can explain. It's not what it looks like. Walter is hallucinating. I'm not hallucinating, Curtis," I said, pulling a second set of papers from my pocket, the subdivided site plans I'd printed from the worm. "And I'm not the one who signed a contract to tear this house down and build modular units. I believe Arthur and the zoning board might find these plans quite interesting, considering the historical preservation status of this lot." The guests were all standing now. The strategy dinner had turned into a courtroom. Daniela was staring at Curtis, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "You were going to tear it down?" she whispered. "You told me we were building a family here." "Daniela, he's lying," Curtis roared, pointing at me. "He's a senile old man. He's trying to destroy us." "I'm not destroying you, Curtis," I said, walking toward the door. "I'm just revealing the structural flaws in your plan. And as any architect will tell you, once the foundation is gone, the whole thing comes down." I walked out of the house and back toward the shed. I didn't wait to hear the shouting. I didn't wait to see Arthur Vance throw his drink in Curtis's face. I knew exactly what was happening. What I didn't know was that Curtis, pushed into a corner and facing the loss of everything, was about to do something far more desperate than I had ever imagined. I was halfway to the workshop when I heard the sound of breaking glass from the main house. Then, the screaming started. Not the screaming of an argument, the screaming of a woman in terror. I turned back, but the front door of the villa was already being kicked open from the inside. I didn't run back toward the house. I lunged. 35 years of sedentary office work and drafting tables should have made me slow, but adrenaline is a hell of an architect. It reinforces the frame when the load becomes too heavy. I vaulted over the trunk of the fallen Japanese maple, my heart thundering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Through the shattered remnants of the floor-to-ceiling sliding glass door, the one I'd once bragged was unbreakable in my younger, more arrogant days, I saw the wreckage of my life's work. The dining room was a battlefield of spilled Bordeaux and overturned chairs. Arthur Vance was gone. Sarah Miller was gone. But the ghost of their presence lingered in the sharp, metallic tang of fear left in the room. Curtis was in the center of the kitchen, his silk robe torn at the shoulder, looking like a man who had finally let his demons out for a walk. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Daniela. She was huddled against the kitchen island, her face ashen, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't even wipe the tears away. At her feet lay the fragments of the heavy crystal decanter she'd used as a shield. "Where is it, Daniela?" Curtis hissed, his voice a ragged edge of desperation. "The backup drive, the physical copies. I know he gave them to you." "I don't have anything, Curtis," she shrieked. "He showed me the photos at the coffee shop. He showed me the debts. Why didn't you tell me we were drowning?" "I was saving us," Curtis roared, and with a swing of his arm, he swept my Italian cookware off the stove. The heavy copper pots clattered across the floor with a sound that felt like a personal insult to every meal I'd ever cooked in that room. I was building a future while your father was busy rotting in his memories. Now give me the drive, or I swear to God I'll burn this entire structure down with us inside. I stepped through the broken glass. The crunch under my boots was the loudest sound in the world. "The drive isn't in the house, Curtis," I said, my voice eerily steady. "And the future you were building just walked out the door with Arthur Vance. He's already calling his lawyers. Sarah Miller is probably at the courthouse right now filing a restraining order on my behalf. It's over." Curtis spun around. His eyes were bloodshot. The pupils dilated until they were nearly black. He looked at me, then at the jagged glass wall behind me, and for a split second, I saw it, the realization that he was the only thing in this house that didn't belong. "You think you've won?" he whispered, a terrifyingly wide grin spreading across his face. "You think some photos and a few debt reports are going to stop me? Walter, you're an architect. You know how these things work. You can't just remove a load-bearing wall without the roof collapsing. If I go down, I'm taking Daniela's credit, her reputation, and her father's sanctuary with me." What happened next changed everything. Not because of what he said, but because of what he did. He didn't reach for me. He reached for his phone. "Vince?" Curtis barked into the receiver, his eyes locked on mine. "Yeah, it's me. The deal is off. The old man went rogue. Send the guys. Now. Tell them I'm authorizing the immediate liquidation. Everything. Furniture, art, the gear. Just get here before the cops do." He hung up and looked at Daniela. "Pack your bags, Danny. We're leaving, now." "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, her voice finally gaining a tremor of strength. She stood up, using the island for support, and walked over to my side. For the first time in 3 years, she chose my side of the room. "I'm staying here with my father." "The guys aren't coming to help you pack, Curtis," I said, a cold realization dawning on me. "Those are the apex collectors, aren't they? You're giving them my house to save your own skin. They can have whatever they can carry." Curtis shrugged, the sociopathy finally on full display. "They want their money. Fine. Let them take the Stanley legacy. I'm out." He grabbed his keys from the counter and headed for the front door. But I didn't stop him. I didn't have to. As he pulled the heavy oak door open, the headlights of 3 black SUVs swept across the foyer. They hadn't waited for his call. They were already there. The next hour was a masterclass in organized chaos. I'd seen construction crews dismantle a frame in hours, but these men were surgeons. 4 of them entered the house, big, silent men who didn't look at us, didn't talk, and certainly didn't care about the historical status of the property. They began to move through the house with a terrifying efficiency. My Leica cameras, gone into padded bags. My wife's antique jewelry from the safe, emptied into a briefcase. The original sketches of the house, the ones I'd hand-drawn 20 years ago, they didn't even see the value in them. They just tossed them onto the floor to get to the silver tray underneath. "Stop them," Daniela cried, grabbing my arm. "Dad, call the police." "The police are 10 minutes away, Danny," I whispered, watching as they started unhooking the custom audio system. "And these men, they have a contract signed by your husband. Legally, it's a civil matter until a judge says otherwise." Curtis gave them permission to be here. I watched Curtis standing by the front door, his face a mask of smug cowardice. He thought he was buying his way out of a debt with my soul. He thought that by letting them strip the house, he was wiping the slate clean. I didn't know it yet, but I was counting on his arrogance. I'd lived in that shed for 3 weeks. I'd been humiliated, cold, and discarded. But during those long nights, I hadn't just been watching them. I'd been reinforcing the one thing Curtis never bothered to check, the digital foundation. As the men moved toward the master suite to take the art off the walls, I pulled my burner phone from my pocket and tapped a single command. Sequence. Lockdown. Suddenly, the house groaned. It wasn't a physical sound, but a digital one, the sound of every smart lock, every motorized shutter, and every magnetic deadbolt I'd installed in the 2018 retrofit, slamming shut simultaneously. The heavy, steel-reinforced security shutters I'd designed to protect the house from winter storms and wildfires dropped over the broken glass wall with a thunderous clang. The front door, still open with Curtis standing in the threshold, hissed as the magnetic locks engaged, pinning his sleeve against the frame. The house went from a glowing jewel to a sealed vault in 3 seconds. "What the hell?" one of the men shouted, dropping a box of my vintage lenses. The lights didn't just go out, they turned a blinding, oscillating red. The smart home alarm I'd programmed for a home invasion began to blare a high-frequency pitch designed to disorient and nauseate anyone inside. "Daniela, the laundry room. Now," I yelled over the siren. I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the server room. We slipped through the false panel just as the internal motion sensors triggered the safe zone protocols, sealing the laundry room behind a 3-inch thick fire door. We were in the dark, save for the blue blinking lights of the server rack. The sound of the alarm was muffled here, but we could still hear the frantic pounding of fists against the steel shutters. "What did you do?" Daniela gasped, her eyes wide in the dark. "I activated the total occupancy defense," I said, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "When I designed this system, I was paranoid about a wildfire trapping someone inside. I built a way to seal the house and reroute the oxygen to the safe rooms while the external sensors call for emergency services. But I also built it so that nobody, not even someone with the master code, can open those shutters from the inside once the conflict protocol is engaged. So, they're trapped?" "They're trapped," I said, looking at the monitor on the wall. I switched the feed to the front door. Curtis was still there, his sleeve caught in the magnetic lock, his face pressed against the glass side light. He was screaming, but no sound came through the reinforced frame. Behind him, the men from Apex were trying to use a crowbar on the steel shutters, but it was like trying to peel an orange with a toothpick. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a heavy, cold weight. My house was no longer a home, it was a prison. And the people inside, my son-in-law and the sharks he'd invited, were finally getting exactly what they'd paid for. Total, uninterrupted access to the Stanley estate. I thought this was the end of the escalation. I thought I'd finally caged the wolves. But as I watched the monitor, I saw something that made my heart stop. Curtis wasn't just trying to get out. He was reaching into his pocket for a lighter. He looked directly into the security camera. He knew I was watching. He knew I was in the safe room. He didn't care about the debt anymore. He didn't care about the house. He was looking at the stack of original blueprints and old photographs, the only things the Apex guys hadn't taken, and he was flicking the flame. "Dad," Daniela whispered, her voice trembling. "The smoke sensors. They aren't going to open the shutters, are they?" "No," I said, the horror settling in. "The shutters are designed to keep the fire out. If a fire starts inside while they're locked, the house becomes an oven." I looked at the monitor. Curtis was holding the flame to the corner of the blueprints. The paper caught instantly. I'd built a masterpiece to last a century, and now I had to decide if I was going to let it burn to the ground just to make sure the man who betrayed me didn't walk away. The smoke began to curl into the air, obscuring the camera feed. "What do we do?" Daniela cried, clutching my hand. "Dad, please, we have to let them out." I looked at the release button on the console. It was glowing red, a steady, mocking heartbeat in the dark. I didn't know it yet, but my next move wouldn't just save the house. It would reveal the final, most devastating secret. Curtis had been keeping a secret that was hidden not in the house, but in the very foundation I'd built for Daniela. The release button under my thumb felt like the trigger of a gun. If I pressed it, I let the wolves back into the world. If I didn't, I watched the man who broke my heart and the daughter I still loved choke on the smoke of my memories. "Dad, please." Daniela's voice was a jagged shard of glass in the dark. "He's a monster, but I don't want to watch him die. Let them out." I looked at the monitor. The smoke was thick now, a swirling gray ghost that obscured the kitchen. Curtis was doubled over, coughing, still clutching that lighter like it was a talisman. The Apex men had abandoned the furniture. They were throwing their weight against the steel shutters, their silent, professional cool replaced by the frantic, animalistic panic of the trapped. I didn't press the release button, not yet. Instead, I reached for the environmental override toggle. When I built Vista Point, I'd designed it for a 100-year lifespan. That included a high-pressure, fine mist fire suppression system. It wasn't the cheap stuff that ruined electronics. It was a deionized mist that suffocated the fire by absorbing the heat without flooding the room. It cost more than a luxury sedan to install, and it would leave the house smelling like a hospital for a month, but it was the only way to save the structure. I flipped the switch. On the monitor, the ceiling vents hissed open. A fine, white fog began to descend, instantly dampening the flames on the blueprints. The smoke didn't disappear, but the temperature in the room dropped 30 degrees in seconds. "It's not a door, Danny," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the small room. "It's a pause button. They aren't going to burn, but they aren't going anywhere until the sheriff gets here." I sat back against the server rack, my strength finally deserting me. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a cold, bone-deep exhaustion. I looked at the blue lights of the servers, the digital heart of the house I'd built for a woman who was long gone. "Why, Dad?" Daniela whispered, sliding down the wall to sit next to me. She looked small, her designer dress stained with soot and wine. "Why did you build a house that could become a prison? You always said architecture was about opening doors, not locking them." "I built it to keep the world away from you, Daniela," I said, looking at the ceiling. "I thought if I made the walls strong enough, the pain of your mother leaving would never find you again. I thought if the foundation was deep enough, you'd never feel the ground shake. I was wrong. I built a fortress, but I forgot that the greatest threats always come from the people you give the keys to." We sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the muffled thuds of the collectors trying to break my shutters. On the monitor, I watched the red lights continue to spin, and then I saw it. As the mist cleared the air, I noticed something on the kitchen floor that the Apex men had discarded in their panic. It was a black leather portfolio, the one Curtis always carried to his consulting meetings. It had fallen open when he'd swept the pots off the counter. I leaned in, squinting at the screen. I used the remote camera zoom, focusing on a set of documents that weren't part of the real estate paperwork. They were life insurance forms. My heart didn't just thud, it stopped. I zoomed in further, the high-definition lens picking up the fine print. It was a multi-million-dollar policy on my life. The primary beneficiary wasn't Daniela. It was a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, the same one Helen Clark had identified as Curtis's primary business vehicle. But it was the date on the policy that made the room spin. It had been opened 3 days before I left for Hawaii. And there, at the bottom of the form, was my signature. Except I had never signed it. I didn't know it yet, but the fire wasn't just a moment of desperation for Curtis. It was the centerpiece of a much larger design. He wasn't just trying to steal my house. He was waiting for me to accidentally pass away in a home that he'd already proven was unsafe and confusing for an old man. I looked at Daniela, and for the first time, I felt a flash of pure, unadulterated pity. "Danny," I said, my voice trembling, "look at the screen." She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the document. She was a marketing major. She knew how to read a contract. I watched the color drain from her face until she was as white as the mist in the kitchen. That's a life insurance policy," she whispered. $2 million? Why would you sign that, Dad? We have enough." "I didn't sign it, honey," I said. "Look at the witness signature." She looked. The witness wasn't a notary. It was Daniela Stanley. She recoiled as if the screen had burned her. "No, I didn't. I never signed that. I've never even seen that paper." He must have. He used my digital signature from the tax forms. The betrayal was finally complete. Curtis hadn't just used her to get to the house. He'd used her to facilitate a plan that ended with her father in a grave and her name on the paperwork of a crime. He had turned my daughter into his unwitting accomplice in a murder plot. The sound of sirens finally cut through the Tahoe night, distant but approaching fast. What happened next was the moment my world finally collapsed. I reached for the release button, not to save the house, but to face the man who had turned my life into a blueprint for a tragedy. I hit the button. The magnetic locks hissed. The steel shutters began to grind upward, revealing the flickering blue and red lights of the sheriff's deputies pulling into the drive. I stood up, my joints stiff, and walked out of the laundry room. Daniela followed me, her face a mask of cold, hard rage. We walked through the house, through the white mist that still hung in the air, toward the kitchen. The Apex men didn't wait. As soon as the shutters cleared the floor, they bolted. They didn't care about the silver or the cameras anymore. They were ghosts in the night, disappearing into the woods before the deputies could even get out of their cars. They knew when a job had gone sideways, but Curtis was still there. He was slumped against the kitchen island, his face wet with the fire suppression mist, looking like a drowned rat. He looked up as I approached, and for a second, he tried to find the old swagger. He tried to straighten his silk robe. "Walter," he wheezed, wiping his eyes. "Thank God. The house, the system glitched. It almost killed us. You see, I told you it was unsafe. I told you." He stopped when he saw Daniela. She didn't say a word. She walked up to him and held out her hand. "The phone, Curtis," she said. Her voice was so cold it could have frozen the lake. "Danny, babe, I was just trying to call for help. The phone, now." He handed it over, his fingers trembling. Daniela didn't look at his messages. She didn't look at his photos. She walked over to the sink, turned on the faucet, and held the phone under the water until the screen flickered and died. Then, she dropped it into the disposal and hit the switch. The sound of the grinding electronics was the most satisfying thing I'd ever heard. "The deputies are at the door, Curtis," I said, stepping forward. "They aren't here for a noise complaint. They're here because Gerald Martinez has been at the station for the last hour with a private investigator and a file that makes your life insurance fraud look like a parking ticket." Curtis looked at the front door, where 2 deputies were already coming through the foyer with their flashlights drawn. He looked at me, then at the ruined kitchen, and finally at the black portfolio on the floor. He realized then that the old man hadn't just been hiding in the shed. I'd been the one who designed the trap. "You think you're so smart," he hissed, the cowardice finally turning into a desperate, impotent venom. "You think this house is your victory? Look at it, Walter. It's ruined. It smells like chemicals and smoke. Your masterpiece is a trash heap. I may be going to jail, but you have to live in the wreckage." I looked around the room. He was right. The Italian marble was stained. The cedar beams were charred. The silence was gone, replaced by the crackle of police radios and the drip of the mist from the ceiling. I hit my rock bottom right then. I realized that in winning the war, I'd destroyed the very thing I was fighting for. My house, the only physical connection I had left to Evelyn, was a crime scene. "You're right, Curtis," I said, as the deputies reached him and forced his arms behind his back. "The house is ruined, but a house is just a structure. I'm an architect. I can always rebuild." I watched them lead him away in handcuffs. He was crying now, begging Daniela to talk to him, promising he could explain the Cayman papers. She didn't even look at him as he was pushed into the back of the cruiser. Once the cars were gone and the house was quiet again, Daniela and I stood in the middle of the kitchen. The mist had settled, leaving a thin, glistening film on everything. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "I know, Danny," I said. I walked over to the stack of charred blueprints, the ones Curtis had tried to burn. I picked up the top one. It was the original site plan for the garden. Most of it was black and brittle, but in the center, the drawing of the Japanese maple was still visible. I looked at the ruined room and felt a sudden, strange sense of clarity. The hidden truth wasn't the insurance policy or the debts. The truth was that I'd been holding on to the past so tightly that I hadn't noticed I was suffocating the present. I didn't know it yet, but my revenge wasn't finished. Curtis was in a cell, but the people who had funded him, the ones who had sent those men to my house, were still out there, and they still thought they had a claim to my land. I looked at Daniela. "Pack your things, honey, but not for a motel." "Where are we going?" "We're going to the shed," I said, a small, tired smile touching my lips. Because tomorrow, we start the demolition. Not of the house, but of everything Curtis Fowler ever touched. The reversal had begun. I was no longer the victim. I was the architect of the final twist. The workshop didn't feel like a prison anymore. With Daniela sitting on the edge of the rusty camping cot, her head in her hands, it felt like a confession booth. The smell of sawdust and old polyurethane was a stark contrast to the chemical stench of the fire suppression mist still clinging to our clothes. I sat on my old drafting stool, watching the sun begin to creep over the Tahoe peaks. It was the start of a new day, but the light only served to illuminate the wreckage of my home through the grimy workshop window. "I can't believe I let him put you in here," Daniela whispered, her voice barely audible over the morning birds. She looked around at the boxes of my life stacked like trash. "I saw the brochures he was printing for those senior living facilities, Dad. I told myself it was for your own safety. I told myself you were getting cluttered in the head. How could I be so blind?" "Gaslighting is a slow process, Danny," I said, leaning back. "It's like a building settling. You don't notice the inch-long crack in the foundation until the front door won't open. He didn't just lie to you. He redesigned your reality." I stood up and walked to a hidden floorboard beneath my workbench. I'd spent 3 weeks in this barn, and I hadn't just been sleeping. I'd been digging. I pried the board up, revealing a second, smaller backup drive, the one I hadn't told anyone about, not even Gerald. I didn't know it yet, but the insurance policy was just the tip of the iceberg. Curtis wasn't just a thief. He was a middleman. I plugged the drive into my laptop and turned the screen toward her. When I was monitoring the house Wi-Fi, I found a series of encrypted folders buried in the Fowler Consulting cloud. It took me a week to crack the first one. It wasn't about venture capital, Danny. It was about laundering. Daniela's eyes widened as she scrolled through the files. "These are construction invoices. Millions of dollars for renovations on houses that don't exist?" "Exactly." Curtis was using my reputation, my name, and my blueprints to create ghost projects. He'd tell investors he was developing luxury lakeside properties designed by the great Walter Stanley. He'd take their money, funnel it through Apex to wash it, and then claim the projects fell through due to zoning issues. That's why he needed the Vista Point land subdivided. He needed a physical site to show the bigger fish before he skipped town. But Apex, those men who were in the kitchen, they were threatening him, she said. "Because he got greedy," I explained. "He started skimming from the laundry. He owed Apex $340,000 because he spent their processing fees on his mistress and his designer suits. He thought he could use the equity in this house to pay back the people he was stealing from. He was trying to rob Peter to pay Paul, and we were the ones being sold for parts." What happened next was the moment my shock turned into a cold, calculated hunger for a different kind of justice. I didn't just want Curtis in jail. I wanted the people who had empowered him to lose everything. As the morning progressed, the phone in the workshop rang. It was Gerald. His voice sounded like he'd been up all night, and for a lawyer, he sounded remarkably uncomposed. "Walter, we have a problem. Curtis is talking. He's telling the DA that the insurance fraud was your idea. He's claiming you're in deep debt from Hawaii and that you coached him on how to forge the signatures. He's playing the confused but loyal son-in-law card, and since Daniela's name is on the witness line, the DA is looking at her too." Daniela let out a choked sob. "Let them look," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Gerald, I have the Ghost Project invoices. I have the digital trail showing Curtis accessed the tax forms from his laptop while I was in Honolulu. But we're not going to the DA yet. We're going to give the sharks exactly what they want." "What are you talking about?" "Apex," I said. "They still think the liquidation is ongoing. They didn't get the art or the house. They're going to come back for the land. I want you to set up a meeting, not with the collectors, with the man at the top, Marcus Gray." I hung up before Gerald could argue. The reversal was simple in theory, but dangerous in practice. An architect knows that if you want to bring down a skyscraper, you don't hit the top. You take out the support columns. Marcus Gray was the column. He was the one funding Curtis's consulting firm. He was the one who thought he could use my daughter as a fall guy for a multi-million-dollar fraud. The next 3 days were a blur of high-stakes theater. Daniela stayed in the workshop, her presence kept a secret from everyone but the police. I, meanwhile, Return to the main house. I didn't clean the soot. I didn't fix the glass. I lived in the wreckage, making sure the curtains were open so anyone watching would see the broken old man wandering through his ruined palace. On Thursday, a silver Bentley pulled into the driveway. Marcus Gray didn't look like a shark. He looked like a grandfather. He was in his late 70s, wearing a tweed jacket and carrying a cane with a silver handle. He walked through the broken sliding door with the air of a man visiting a museum. "Walter," he said, his voice a rich, soothing baritone. "I was so sorry to hear about the fire, and about your son-in-law. A terrible business. Truly." "It's a tragedy, Marcus," I said, offering him a seat on one of the few chairs that wasn't stained with mist. "The house. I don't think I have the strength to rebuild. The insurance company is fighting me on the occupancy clause. I'm ruined. That's why I'm here," Gray said, leaning forward. "Curtis was a disappointment, but the land is still magnificent. I'm prepared to take it off your hands. A private sale. I'll settle your debts with Apex. I have some influence there, and I'll give you enough to live out your days in a very comfortable facility in Arizona. No courts, no lawyers, no more stress." He pulled a contract from his jacket. It was already filled out. The purchase price was a joke, maybe 20% of the land's value. "I just need you to sign, Walter, for your daughter's sake. You know the DA is looking at her for the insurance fraud. If the debt disappears, I can make sure the investigation into Daniela disappears too. I have friends in the State House." I didn't know it yet, but Marcus Gray had just admitted to a felony in my own kitchen. He didn't realize that while I was confused, I had never turned off the smart home audio feed. "You'd do that for her?" I asked, my hand trembling as I reached for the pen. "You'd save my Danny? Family is everything, Walter," he said, his eyes as cold as a shark's. I signed the paper. Marcus Gray smiled, a thin, predatory line. He took the contract, blew on the ink, and stood up. "You've made the right choice, old man. I'll have my people contact you about the moving arrangements." He walked out feeling like the victor. He had the land, he had the leverage, and he thought he'd silenced the only witness left. As his Bentley pulled away, I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I walked to the server room and hit stop recording. "Did you get it?" I asked. Helen Clark stepped out from behind the false panel, her hawk-like eyes glowing with satisfaction. She was holding a digital recorder, clear as a bell, admitting to interfering with a criminal investigation, extortion, and the confirmation that Apex reports directly to him. "This isn't just a civil case anymore, Walter. This is RICO." But the reversal wasn't over. The hidden truth I'd found on that second drive, the one I hadn't even told Daniela, was the real reason Marcus Gray wanted this land. It wasn't for modular homes. When I broke ground on Vista Point 20 years ago, I'd found a series of underground tunnels, old silver mine shafts from the 1800s that hadn't been mapped. I'd sealed them up and built the foundation on top of them, reinforced with extra concrete. But according to the Ghost Project files, Marcus Gray knew those tunnels didn't just sit under my house. They connected to the neighboring state park land where he was illegally dumping toxic runoff from his real estate developments. He didn't want my house. He wanted the access point to hide his environmental crimes before the EPA inspection next month. "Revenge is a slow build," I whispered to the empty room. "But the demolition? That happens in an instant." I picked up my phone and called Gerald. "Execute Phase 3. Tell the EPA that the Stanley Educational Trust is requesting an immediate environmental audit of the mine shafts under 2847 Lakeshore Boulevard. And tell them we have the maps showing exactly where the runoff is coming from." I walked out onto the deck and looked at the lake. I'd hit rock bottom in that shed. I'd watched my daughter betray me and my son-in-law try to burn my life down. But, as I stood there, I realized that I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the architect. I'd built a cage for Marcus Gray, and I'd used his own greed as the blueprint. What happened next would be the final twist, the one that would ensure that Curtis Fowler never saw the light of day, and that Marcus Gray's empire crumbled into the very shafts he'd tried to hide. But first, I had to do one more thing. I had to go back to the shed and tell Daniela that her father wasn't just managing. I was building us a new life. And this time, the foundation was going to be made of the one thing Curtis never understood: truth. I thought the reversal was complete. I thought I had them. But as I walked toward the workshop, I saw a white Lexus pulling into the drive. The realtor was back. And she wasn't alone. She had a man in a suit with her, a man who looked suspiciously like a federal agent, and they weren't looking for Marcus Gray. They were looking for me. The man in the charcoal suit didn't reach for handcuffs. He didn't even reach for his holster. Instead, as I stood there on the gravel path with my heart trying to kick its way out of my chest, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a gold badge. "Walter Stanley?" he asked, his voice crisp and devoid of the predatory edge Marcus Gray's had. "I'm Special Agent Miller with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and I believe you've already met my colleague, Sarah." The realtor, the woman who had walked through my home with a tablet and a cold eye for appraisals, stepped forward. But she wasn't holding a real estate contract anymore. She was holding a federal warrant. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I thought you were with them." "We've been monitoring Marcus Gray's Ghost Project network for 18 months, Mr. Stanley," Agent Miller said, gesturing toward the house. "We knew Curtis Fowler was the weak link in the chain. We knew he was skimming. What we didn't know was how deep the environmental dumping went until your attorney, Mr. Martinez, delivered your digital files to us 3 hours ago." Sarah, the realtor, offered me a small, almost apologetic smile. "The appraisal I did last week? It wasn't for a bridge loan, Walter. I was planting localized seismic sensors in the basement to map the mine shafts. We needed proof that the runoff from Gray's developments was being rerouted through your property. You provided the missing piece of the puzzle, the direct admission of extortion you just recorded on your smart home server." I looked at the house, then back at the agents. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, a dry, hysterical sound. "So I wasn't just being a paranoid old man in a shed. You were the only person in this entire conspiracy who was telling the truth," Miller said. "And because you were, we're going to be able to seize every asset Marcus Gray owns under the RICO Act. That includes the funds he stole from your ghost projects. We're going to get your money back, Walter. Most of it, anyway." But the money didn't matter. What mattered was the look on Daniela's face as she stepped out of the workshop. She had heard everything. She stood there in the morning light, looking at the federal agents, then at me. For the first time in 3 years, the fog in her eyes was completely gone. The architecture of her life had been a lie, but she was finally standing on solid ground. What happened over the next 6 months was a masterclass in what I like to call systemic demolition. Curtis Fowler didn't go down quietly. He tried to cut 3 different deals with the DA, trying to trade information on me for a lighter sentence. He claimed I was the mastermind, that I was the one who had designed the laundering scheme. But the feds didn't care about his stories. They had the digital worm logs. They had the timestamps showing he'd accessed the files while I was 4,000 miles away in Hawaii. They had the life insurance forgery. Curtis is currently serving 12 years in a federal penitentiary in Lompoc. From what Gerald tells me, he's spent most of his time trying to consult with his cellmates on how to leverage their commissary snacks. Some habits, it seems, are built into the frame. Marcus Gray's empire collapsed like a skyscraper with a hollowed-out core. The environmental fines alone were enough to bankrupt him, but the RICO charges finished the job. He lost his Bentley, his Tahoe mansions, and his silver-handled cane. He's 81 years old, and he'll likely spend the rest of his life in a facility that looks a lot less like a resort and a lot more like the assisted living brochures he'd tried to force on me. But the real resolution didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened at Vista Point. The house was technically a crime scene for a month. The smell of the fire mist and the charred beams made it unoccupiable. I spent that time in a small rental in town, but I didn't mind. I had Daniela with me. She worked with the police. She worked with the IRS. And she worked on herself. She spent hours in therapy, deconstructing the version of herself that Curtis had built. One afternoon in late October, we returned to the house together. The air was crisp, and the Japanese maple, the one Curtis had cut down, was gone, leaving a raw, empty circle in the dirt. "What are you going to do, Dad?" Daniela asked as we stood on the deck, looking at the charred interior. "The repairs are going to cost a fortune. Maybe we should just sell the lot and start over. Build something smaller." I looked at the blueprints in my hand, the ones that hadn't been burned. I looked at the way the light hit the lake, the exact same way it had 30 years ago when Evelyn and I first stood on this dirt. "I'm not going to rebuild a house, Danny," I said. "I'm going to finish the design." I didn't sell the land. I didn't take the insurance money and run to a condo in Florida. Instead, I used the Stanley Educational Trust for exactly what I'd intended. I hired a team of young, hungry architecture students from the scholarship fund I'd started. I told them the house wasn't a residence anymore, it was a lab. We kept the charred beams. We kept the scarring on the marble. We turned the main living area into an open-plan studio for low-income design students. The master suite became a library. The kitchen, once a battlefield, became a communal space where the next generation of architects could talk about how to build things that matter. And the shed, the workshop where I'd spent my 3 weeks of exile, I didn't tear it down. I reinforced it. I added insulation, a real bed, and a skylight that catches the North Star at night. It's my favorite place to sleep. It reminds me that a man doesn't need 3,000 square feet of glass to be whole. He just needs a foundation he can trust. Daniela is the program director for the foundation. She's not a marketing shark anymore. She's the one who manages the scholarships, the one who talks to the kids about the ethics of development, and the one who reminds them that the most important thing an architect can build is a sense of responsibility. The final twist, the one that caught me completely off guard, happened just last week. I was cleaning out the server room, finally removing the last of the digital defenses I'd built during the siege, when I found a physical envelope taped to the back of the master junction box. It was dusty, the paper yellowed with age. It was a letter from Evelyn, dated 20 years ago the week we moved in. Walter, it read, I know how you worry. I know you think this house has to be perfect to keep us safe. But remember, a house is just a body. The spirit is the people inside. If the walls ever get too heavy, don't be afraid to let the light in, even if you have to break a few windows to do it. I sat on the floor of the laundry room and cried for the first time in years. She had known. Even then, she had known that I was building a fortress when I should have been building a home. I didn't know it back in June when I returned from Hawaii, but being kicked into that shed was the best thing that ever happened to me. It stripped away the ego, the landmarks, and the dead capital. It forced me to see my daughter for who she was, and it forced her to see the world for what it is. The moral of the story isn't about revenge. Revenge is just a side effect of gravity. What goes up must come down. The real story is about the architecture of the soul. If you build your life on greed, ambition, and lies, it doesn't matter how beautiful the glass is. The foundation will eventually settle, the beams will groan, and the whole thing will come crashing down around your ears. But if you build on truth, if you're willing to live in the barn until the air clears, then you can survive any storm. I stood up and walked out of the house, heading toward the garden. I had a new Japanese maple in the back of my truck, a small, spindly thing with deep red leaves. Daniela was waiting for me with a shovel. "Ready, Dad?" she asked. "Ready," I said. We dug the hole together. We set the roots deep in the Tahoe soil. And as we packed the earth back down, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the foundation. I knew it was solid. Because this time, we weren't building a monument. We were just planting a tree. And the view from here? It's absolutely perfect.